Good evening, class. My name is Damian Chandler. I am excited about sharing my project or my paper with you. It is entitled Sexual Desire Discrepancy in Marriage. Where is the libido? Let's talk about sex. So, I am a Christian pastor, and in the context that I'm in, um, I end up doing a lot of premarital counseling. And what I've found is that in a traditional Christian setting like mine, sex is never really an open topic to discuss. So when couples come in to see me, oftentimes their experiences with sexual conversation has been not positive. There are two types of people that I end up seeing in pastoral or premarital counseling when it comes to sex and their sexual experience. One, the first person, the conversation was non-existent. It was, I believe the term is faux pas. You don't discuss it. Oftentimes in those types of settings, that was done in order to protect them from the demon of sex. And so those conversations were just never had. The second group of people were the people for whom the conversation was harmful because they had sex before marriage, and in conservative Christian environments, that is an absolute no-go. Needless to say, they come in with very skewed understandings of sex and sexuality. And they're hoping that just by saying I do, everything will be corrected. Unfortunately, what they find is that they are getting into a situation where sex, sexuality, and libido end up being major issues in their marriage. One of the things that they find in premarital counseling is that they experience or they find themselves sexually mismatched or experiencing sexual desire discrepancy. Laura Vowles and Kristen Mark define sexual desire discrepancy as when one member of a couple experiences more or less sexual desire relative to their partner. They suggest actually that this is one of the main reasons why couples end up seeking therapy. Now, in a Christian setting, and again, in a conservative Christian setting, not only are those conversations about sex moot before marriage, but even after marriage, there is a reticence among married couples to have open conversations. So if they are experiencing sexual mismatch or sexual desire discrepancy or low libido, they're unlikely to have those conversations either in pastoral counseling and oftentimes not even with a therapist. All right. So I wanted to give that background so that we could discuss a little bit further the idea or the vignette that I'm going to present to you a little bit later on. I decided to approach the idea of etiology through the intersystem approach. In order to understand this mismatch, this sexual desire discrepancy that I previously described, we need to look at it through a systematic lens. And Gambicia and Weeks and Hertline suggest an intersystem approach. It's very much like a biopsychosocial approach to sex and sexuality, and it models some of the same theories. It takes into account really four areas or domains. The first one is the individual system, which considers individual psychological, biological, and medical concerns that impact sex. The second one is intergenerational. So let's go to that first one more time. Right there, we're looking at are there any biological areas that would affect sexual libido, medical concerns that might impact sexual libido? For example, does this person have cancer? Does this person have heart issues? Are there changes in approach or things that would affect their desire to have sex? Is there psychological when it comes to self-esteem, when it comes to body image that would affect their desire to make love or to have sex? Intergenerational influences or family factors. What has a couple learned from their family about sex, both intentionally and unintentionally? And I think that that last two is very important because sometimes what we're learning about sex are not the things that people are saying, but actually the things that people are not saying. And then there's a contextual system that considers the influence of society and culture on one's sexual understanding. And then the dyadic relationship. How does this now unique couple that came together and got married, how do they deal with issues of conflict, communication, and intimacy in the sexual relationship? Really important. So Garbesia suggested this intersystem approach. And what the intersystem approach does is that it sets up these domains, and from these domains, it gives us examples of questions and questioning and lines of questioning that we could approach when it comes to our assessment. And so I found this extremely helpful. All of this background information when we're talking about libido, when we're talking about sexual matching, or whether or not someone is experiencing a discrepancy in desire. These things help us to be able to trace where those issues might be coming from. All right. Just before we go to the DSM diagnosis, I want to touch on this slide one more time. When it comes to biological considerations, I know that I mentioned it earlier, but when it comes to biological considerations, this intersystem approach is extremely important. Because what they find is this lady, Margaret Nussbaum, and her crew, they highlight the fact that proper sexual function depends on neurological, vascular, and endocrine systems, all three working together. When any of these are compromised, it's going to affect libido. Further, there is a psychological impact that can happen when someone, for example, a cancer patient is their body has changed, areas have morphed, they have gained weight, they've lost hair. It affects their self, the way that they see themselves, and their courage, and even desire to want to have sex. All right. The DSM diagnosis for sexual dysfunction offers diagnosis into a person's ability to respond sexually or experience sexual pleasure. However, once again, it's plagued with two revealing issues. Binary diagnosis. Oftentimes, through many of these diagnoses, it will say female or male, and it doesn't leave room for people with other identities who choose other identities. And then it seems to suggest to me a lean towards biological ideology when it comes to sexual dysfunction. And everything when it comes to sexual dysfunction or libido does not boil down to biology. All right, so specific to now my vignette, what I will be presenting to you is a male client. We are going to call that male client John, and he has erectile dysfunction. John struggles with sexual expression because of that conservative religious narrative that we mentioned earlier when it comes to sex. For him, the physical expression of his anxiety and sexual expression is expressed in low libido. So he came from a home where sex was not discussed, where conversations about sex were discussed in private if they happened at all, and created a sense of shame, a sense that, I need to stay as far away from sex as possible so that I can be right with God because I'm not married. Now he gets married. He's not able to shake that, all of that built up indoctrination when it comes to sex. He initially mentions to the therapist that he never feels like he's in the mood, but later he admits that he also has a hard time staying hard, even ever since he has been married, and they have been married for 3 years. Female client, we're going to call Mary. We diagnosed her with other specified sexual dysfunction, F52.8. Mary is experiencing sexual repression. And so for Mary, she says that she likes to have sex, but never felt like it was a woman's right to want it. She has a higher libido and desires more sex, but doesn't know how to express it. So in the culture that we live in, Mary, it's a very patriarchal culture where men are able to talk about sex and talk about wanting to have sex. Here we have a female who desires to have sex, but doesn't feel confident in saying that, doesn't feel like if it's her place. Again, because the DSM is very binary, there might have been some diagnoses that would have fit her better, but those diagnoses, at least at this particular point, are male, female. So we went with other specified sexual dysfunction. All right, so for the treatment, I chose to go with narrative therapy. I wanted to be able to break down this problem story that they have. The problem story for John is connected to his religious and cultural understanding of sex, and how that currently affects him and affects his anxiety, bringing anxiety when it comes to having sex. He's received so many negative messages over his life that now it's difficult to be comfortable when it comes to sex. Creates anxiety. That anxiety expresses itself in erectile dysfunction or not being able to stay hard. And so the interventions that were used in treatment are as follows. Sexual genogram, in order to understand both the client's individual and sexual history and how their history and sexual norms of their family of origin and religious background has informed their problem-saturated sexual story. And so we want to be able to do a genogram so we can map their understanding and experience with sex, both their thoughts, what they know, what they've experienced, what they've been taught, and what they've seen. And then we want to go through the process once we have that information of deconstruction to explore negative ideations concerning sex and sexual expression. And we want to break those things down. We want to be able to break down this negative story or narrative. A part of the way we're going to do that is through externalization. Externalization is normally used when it comes to things things like fears. So you make fear a person and you say, when fear shows up, what do you feel? I actually want to bring externalization uh, into this sexual issue by separating sex from the problem. So the question that we would ask is the problem, that the idea, again, a narrative idea is that the problem is not sex. So normally you would say the problem is not the person, but the problem is not sex. The problem is the problem. In other words, the therapist would ask questions like a question for externalization when it comes to sex would be, when shame shows up when you want to make love to your husband, what does shame say? So for Mary, let's say she says, there's sometimes when I feel very erotic and passionate, and I want to just, take off all of my clothes and jump all over my husband. But I don't, because I feel ashamed, because sex is shameful. We would want to separate the two and say, okay, well, when you want to make love to your husband and shame shows up, make it a person. What does shame say to you? It might cause her to say you're not worthy of sex. It might say shame might say you're not worthy of sex, or he doesn't really want you, and then we could go deeper into some of the experiences she's having. And then reconstruction together with the family, with the dyad, we want to mutually co-create a new sexual story. All right, current research. Earlier I talked about sexual match, and past research has shown that in long-term relationships, one of the partners will consistently want more sex than the other partner. And this can create considerable tension and frustration for both. So we talked about sexual match, and the way that sexual match has traditionally been measured is really through a scaling question. So the question goes like this: on a scale of 0 to 5, 0 being less than once a month and 5 being every day, how often do you want to have sex? The difference between the scores, so let's say the male said, in this case, the male said 0, less than once a month, and the wife said a 3. I want to have sex once every 2 weeks. You would take the 3 and subtract the 0, so their different score would be 3. The different score is determined by finding the sum of the two answers, and the lower score, the lower the score determines the sexual match, the better the sexual match. All right. However, recently there's been some seminal research out of the University of Toronto and Dr. James Kim and his team, and they've been challenging this idea of the mismatch theory. They've been actually suggesting that it's actually the frequency of sex, how many times we have sex, and not the sexual match, whether or not we want sex equally as much, that leads to relational and sexual satisfaction or dysfunction. So, for example, if you had two couples, remember 0 is less than one sexual encounter a month. Let's say you had a couple who had a 0, and the male was a 0 and the female was a 1. Well, then when it comes to the idea of sexual match, their number would actually be lower. And sexual match theory would suggest that they are more satisfied in their relationship and in their sexual experience. However, Dr. Kim suggests that a couple where the male is a 4, so he wants to have sex twice a week, and the female is a 2, she wants to have sex every other week. Well, the difference between the 4 and the 2 would be 2. So you would think that they would be less happy and less satisfied sexually. But they're suggesting because the frequency of sex based on that couple, based on the lowest number offered, which will be once every other week, is higher than the first couple that I mentioned. The frequency of sex trumps the idea of sexual match. So that opens up new windows and new doors of understanding as to how we should help couples that are challenged by